Hello, welcome to another edition of the Low Code Café. This is episode number 151 for December 13th, 2023. Today we're going to be exploring the value of intermediate API endpoints. We'll also get into the current hotfixes and some plans for coming up later in the month. This is an event we do every Wednesday, bi-weekly, every other Wednesday at 10 a.m. Central Time. And it's just an opportunity for us to demonstrate, to give you updates about our product, to demonstrate techniques, and we spend the most amount of our time on hands-on low coding. All these are recorded and put out on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/plantanap. So do subscribe to that. Hit the alarm bell. You'll get notified anytime we post new content to YouTube. Today, pretty simple agenda. We'll be talking about our hotfixes in the from the trenches segment, and then I'll get into hands-on low-code development. We'll deal with talking about these intermediate API endpoints. As I mentioned, this is something that we do bi-weekly on a normal basis, but the next live webinar is scheduled for next week, December 20th. We'll be doing an end-of-year special. Bogdan will be joining us talking about where the product is headed, our product roadmap, as well as we'll cover some things about what's been done in the product in recent times, and just generally where we're going as an organization. So that will be a good one to attend. So let's dive in. Previous to this, we're on version 1.25 of Plantanap, and it's been a long development cycle. That's one of the things that you'll hear about next week, that we will be enhancing, releasing the 1.26. So the plans for releasing 1.26, we're very, very close to getting that done. So we should have actual dates. It will likely be sometime at the first of the year, just so that it doesn't happen over the Christmas holidays, but we'll see about that. So we've previously released 72 hotfixes, and to this period, we're releasing 3 more. Just a second here. Patrick somehow got it in. Patrick Anderson, technical support manager for Plantanap, somehow got in as a attendee. I'm promoting him to panelist so that he can help me out if I get into trouble. Hi, Patrick. So on these hotfixes, good morning. On these hotfixes, I've mentioned before, but we had some changes to our software in midstream, and while you can get individual hotfixes, many of them have this note about needing App Builder 125, 164 in order to work right. So just watch carefully for that, follow the instructions, and if you have any questions at all, you're welcome to enter a support ticket, and I'll help you through your individual circumstance, your versions, what you're trying to accomplish. So we have some, it's 4 hotfixes. Some of them include multiple things, and these are some of these we've been waiting for a while, so it's worth talking about. The first one in App Builder, there is a fix where dealing with workflows, the input parameter not being updated. So this has been kind of an inconvenient feature of workflows for a long time, where in workflows you name inputs and outputs, and if you happen to name an input A, doesn't matter what you called it, and then you try to output the same parameter output A, that value, and you changed it in the middle, that change wasn't being passed on. So it was a really bad idea to have an input and output named the same thing. We've fixed that, and so now it works as you would expect, and so that particular stumbling block has been removed. We had a case separately, this parameter name property in our new user interface. There's the partially update an entity actions that we create for you, and in some cases the property list, being able to select which property gets updated wasn't listed in the drop down, so that's been fixed. And in some cases you would get a duplicate module of an entity page, so we create lots of good content for you, the ability to create, read, update, delete, but sometimes we're getting a duplicate, and so that's been eliminated. On our form builder, we discovered a somewhat hidden bug that if you happen to have a text field on forms and you put a date in a particular format, an ISO format date, in that text field, the text box would consider that, look at that and say, oh, that's a date. So normally you would think of a text box as whatever you input into the text box, that would be what value you would get on submit. But if it was a date and it recognized it as a date, the system might have adjusted it to become adjusted it for the local time zone, or put it into UTC time zone. But regardless, it was manipulating the date, and we stopped that. And then if you use, not many of our clients use dynamic fields. Dynamic fields we've covered in a previous episode, the ability to in real time put fields onto a form, but we weren't handling the secure input feature. There's a option to say whether or not you're going to do secure input, which interprets, prevents you from doing certain characters within the input. And we weren't honoring that, and now we are. So a couple of bug fixes. So a couple of nice enhancements. In the date time relative token, there's now the ability to compute date and time with hours, minutes, and seconds. And I had to just look into that. The old date time, this is an older system, and so there's this token date time relative that allowed you to compute days, weeks, months, years relative to the current date. And in the new system, it now has the option to say seconds, minutes, hours as well. So a little bit more built-in capability for that. Also within tokens, there is a whether or not the token should be evaluated. So let's see if I can create one here. Have to add a test namespace. Doesn't add a token and do it as a test token, and it's going to be a constant token. If I save and test this, I get it's just evaluating the whatever the value of the constant is. That's what it's bringing back. There's some options in here. One of them is this is the option that we're talking about. If you activate the evaluate output tokens, then when we test this, instead it actually after it gets the token, it expands it. So you now, with a constant token, have the option of being able to return something that is also a token without it being evaluated. In general, let's see. So when you set these up, I think the old behavior was, and Patrick, maybe you can help me with this. The old behavior was that by default, this was evaluating, so you couldn't return back a bracket token, and now you can turn that off and return a bracket token. Patrick isn't arguing with me, so it must be right.
Yep, that sounds like the right thing to me. Yep.
Okay, thank you. And so that can be handy, for example, in a case where you might be storing the template of something that's going to get expanded later on in a token, making it very findable and maintainable in a centralized place. You'll now retrieve back that template without evaluation, and then you get to choose the time of evaluating it by using a create update tokens action, for example, to use that. Handy thing. And a little bit esoteric, but could be useful for you. If you use our search tool, we're now letting you pass in multiple values into the database rules. So search, we have, if you've been into search before, there's a database indexing rules, the ability to index things that are in your database and include those in your search results. And I'm just going to work through one of these here quickly. So you say what database that you want to retrieve, the query that's going to retrieve the data. You have the columns that get brought into the indexing, and you get to define what it all looks like. But down here at the bottom, there is a additional custom data, and this is the ability to index this one thing. And if you get down into the weeds here, or the details, you can do a query string where you can pass to the search to say what it is that you want to retrieve, and you can filter based on SBC first name, for example, that you want a particular value. But we now support comma delimited list, so you could pass in A comma B comma C and retrieve all the data that matches that list. So and Patrick, can you put in a bug fix? Because
I was noticing that.
Now we have a comma delimited list.
Yeah.
Completely different. But anyway, yes. So bottom line is it adds abilities in your ability to filter search results, which in certain circumstances is very handy. All right. We do another event every week. It's the Low Code Campfire. We do it at the same hour. That's every week. And we just get together, talk about Plant and App in general, and oftentimes dig down into exactly the issues that are facing low-code developers in Plant and App, and oftentimes the community, or sometimes the panelists. Patrick and I help solve issues, but it's a very good opportunity to meet up with your other low coders, and it's once a week. Drop in when you can. Patrick, perhaps I think you're now able to post this. Here's the links for this episode, the ability to register for Low Code Campfire, the webinar recordings, our community portal. By the way, the community portal, for anybody who's been using it in the last week or so, for some reason it wasn't sending out emails. We've got that fixed. So when you post something in there, everyone who's subscribed to the community portal will see your question, and they and we can help answer those questions. So good feature, good thing to be part of. And then you can get into our webinar feedback form if you have any comments for me about these episodes or things that you'd like to see. That's a great place to do that. All right, so let's get on with hands-on low coding and exploring intermediate API endpoints. In order to do that, we're going to have to talk about API endpoints to start with, right? The idea is that your application can communicate with other systems on the internet. There's a wide variety of APIs. We've covered some of them in the past. For example, the ability to communicate with Zoom and to set up meetings or webinars or things like that, to be able to control these other apps in the Internet of Things. I'll just point out that there are many free API endpoints available. I searched for a list and found some, and landed on News API as something to demonstrate for today. They have top headlines. They have a variety of news sources, and I'm using the news sources as an endpoint to illustrate what we're going to do today. So they have a get endpoint within their and we can start digging down into this in just a second, but they have a get endpoint that returns a lot of news sources, and we're going to I've already done it. We'll demonstrate it and then we'll show you how to build it. But we have a Plant and App application that lists out the data from that endpoint. And among other things, errors aren't handled gracefully. So we're going to dig into what that looks like. So let's take a look at that. The news API, and I'm pointing to the documentation now, and it defines that if you want to look at the sources, you would pass in a get to this particular URL. You would pass in your API key, and coming back from that, you would get something that looks like this, that has the ID, the name, the description, URL, category, language, country. There are optional things that you could pass, like category or language or country, so that you can focus in on one particular area or one particular topic category. And it describes exactly what you're going to get back, the status and the sources and whatnot. So this is a very typical API definition, what you're going to see. And so this is the URL that gets used. In the case of News API, I had to do a brief sign up and get an API key. I will, as we go along today, my API key is going to get shown, and I'll just let you know that I'm going to cancel that afterwards. So don't worry about me showing confidential information. You're not going to be able to use it anyway. But as I mentioned, there's many other APIs that you could use to practice this. There was a joke one. There was a weather map one. There was a one for coin digital currency. So lots of different ones you can find to practice with. And then if you have one that you need to communicate with, that's a good one to practice with as well. All right, so that's APIs. And so the typical setup would be that you would wire whatever it is that you're doing. In my case, a listing. I want to get a listing of all the data news sources, and you would wire that to the API. So the idea of intermediate API is that instead you would wire the listing to an API that's under your control, the intermediate one, and that one would talk to the target API. And so there's a variety of benefits of that. If we have time at the end, we'll spend some time talking about all of the benefits, but we'll cover some of them today, including the caching of results for speed and maybe for other reasons, and then error handling, what happens if things go wrong. So just to kind of give you an idea of where we're going, I have this. This is my test area where I took a look in advance. This is wired to that news API endpoint. It returns back things like maybe the news, the name, whatever. You can search it. You can focus in on a particular category. All this using standard listing data source. But one of the things that I wanted to point out, I'm going to simulate an error here. It doesn't matter how I'm simulating it, but if that endpoint were not available and we get a bad request and a response back, there's not really any on errors built into our listing. And so it's possible that you can get into something that doesn't, an error that doesn't look really nice to your users. And that's really the reason we got into that. I had a request from on a support channel, somebody wondering about how to avoid that. And so I thought this would be a really great topic to bring into Low Code Cafe. So that's what we're going to build, something that talks to that listing. and does some of those advantages. So we've already covered what that external endpoint is and how to call it, what it's all about. So we can move on from that. And so we'll dive right into how do you directly connect to an endpoint, to an action grid, to a listing. So I have a empty system here, and so we'll start from scratch on the empty system. This is just as it initially gets provisioned if you use Plainton App Software as a Service. And so we'll go ahead and create a page for this, and then we'll add a listing. So this is going to be our, we'll create a new page that's called Sources. This is going to appear right on the site root. We're going to make it visible to all users, and from an edit perspective, we're going to allow the administrators and the citizen developers to edit the page. So by doing that, if we look on the website now, we see that we have a new sources page in the menu that we can click, and it's an empty page. I'm going to add so again, our goal is we're going to connect up to our endpoint. So we're going to add a listing, put the page into edit mode, and say that I want to add a module. The module is action grid. That's the name of our listing module. And we've dropped it on the page. I'm going to go into settings and begin to configure it. The first thing that it wants to know is the data source. Where is this data coming from? And lots of times you see us deal with, for example, a SQL query pulling data out of our database. But today we're going to do server request, and so that provides us a slightly different look. The URL that we're going to do is this one. We can just copy it from here and paste it in here, but we have to have an API key. And so now I've got to go look up on my API key.
Dale, do you know, is a constant token an option here or no?
Constant token, it is. And
it is, okay, all right.
That's probably would be a good design pattern rather than building it in here, but we'll do it anyway. We just pop the API key in. So this is as straightforward as possible. And let me just demonstrate when you're doing a get, most of the time you can use the same URL with the same API key just in a browser window, and you're going to get all the data coming back. So this is one way to verify that you're getting good data, right? It's hard, and you can't do the other types of transactions, the post, for example, but you can do a get on a browser window. You can use Postman, other tools to be able to query after APIs as well. But just a proof that this URL should work, the method that we're going to do is a get. I'm not going to pass anything else, just we're going to get all of the data back. And then we have to set some other properties in here. So within the data, there was an ID. I'm sorry, we can see it here. It wants something unique to identify each row, and we can look and see, okay, this ID is going to be unique, so that's what we'll use as the ID property. We can do a base name, and that helps to create the field. So I'm going to use sources as the base name. And then there's another one, path inside JSON. And I should have left this up here. Well, I'm sorry, we can see it here. This is the structure of what you're going to get back. And what we want is the array inside sources. And so by using sources, by the way, these are case specific, so you can't say capital sources, it must be sources. That way it knows to ignore the things outside of sources and just return the array of sources. And this particular API, interestingly enough, needs to have a custom header. It's really not in the documentation, but without it, we see an error. Actually, I'll just do it without it so that you can see the error. So we'll save. When we save, it tries to. Whoa, it didn't need it. Interesting. We'll see how that turns out. So we say add fields. We can see that it's gotten all the fields based on the what's returned back in that JSON payload. So we're just going to add all these to our listing just to make it very simple. And so we will save those changes. And once they're saved, we'll go back and take a look at the page. And so already we see data coming back, and we have the ability to search through that. And yeah, so this is just wired directly to the API. I'm still in edit mode. I'm going to open this in a new tab so that I can manipulate it and see the result at the same time. Then I'm going to close out of edit mode on the page so we can just see it. So I'm going to call this the sources listing. That'll improve the title on the, I'm sorry, we'll call it new sources. And just making that change gives us, that just changes this title right here. And then we could do some cleanup. Let's do some cleanup. The ID, we can improve this to say ID. Maybe we want it to capitalize. But I also want to be able to filter based on that. And in the same way, we can clean up some of these others. Just standard manipulation of action grid once you have a data source. Making these last ones filterable, which adds a nice ability to take a look at the result. So now when I refresh, I have filtering boxes. My titles are what you would expect. We have our normal sort capabilities, so we can sort things in order. We can look for things in particular languages. So we have nice capability. So that's the beginning spot, right? We needed to be able to connect to an external API, to an action grid, and then see that information is being returned. But now we get into what we're really trying to do, trying to demonstrate how do you set up an intermediate API and what are the values of it. So if you have an intermediate API, now all the calls, and I'm saying intermediate, this is one that we're going to define on our plant and app instance. Now that gives us full control over that. So instead of calling the API, the remote API directly, or we'll set up our listing to call our API, and ours will call the remote one. That gives us all kinds of ability, including the ability to control it, to monitor it, to do error handling, and to do caching. So that's where we're going. So let's create that. It's really pretty straightforward. We're going to create our own API that returns this same payload, identical payload. So the listing won't have to change at all. We just point to ours. So this is done within the configuration page. I'm going to open that up. And we can create, we have we go into the APIs section, and we can create our first new API. I am going to call this API the news API headline sources. We can call it anything we want, but that's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to still leave it as a get. So this is what we're going to wire to our listing. It's enabled, it's debugged. I'm not going to turn on caching yet, so we can demonstrate what that looks like. And for inputs, I'm going to embed, we're not going to need the API key to be passed in, because I'm going to encode it directly into this API. But we could, for example, pass in one of the other parameters, like let's do language, that could be passed in, and when we pass in a language, then it will the call that it will make out to the remote API will do some filtering for us. We could do all of them, but in the interest of time, I'll just pick one. And then for our actions, what we're going to want to do is the server request action is the action that lets us talk to a remote server. By the way, once you're at version 1.25.195, we now have a new server request action that's experimental. It has some new abilities that let you, for example, send a file to a remote server, or use credentials to have higher security. But we're going to use the long-standing server request action that we have, and it lets us pass a URL and get data back. So the URL that we're going to call is the same one that we had over here in our existing data source. Look like that. So we'll just copy and paste, and always important to look at all the parameters for a server request. The main one that can confuse people is you have to pick what kind of HTTP method that you use. We're doing a get. If you don't pick, it's going to error out, but it's also not a very friendly error. So make sure that you pick a method. So we're getting out of this. If we want to, going back to wiring this to language, it says that we can pass the language request parameter in our payload, and so we'll do that. So we'll say language equals and then something. Well, the something is this parameter that we got up here, language. So we will pass that. It might be blank, it might have a value, but we'll see this work here in a second when we do some testing. And then it says that we output. Where is the output going to go? And I am going to put that to a token called results. So this is going to be the JSON payload that comes back. And then the last thing that we need to do is to add a response. And the output response that we want to do, we're just going to do a raw response. And this says that we're going to take whatever we got back, and that's what we're sending back as content. And then I'm going to send a 200 code to say that 200 means okay. And so it's going to return back to the caller the full results. So with that much done, we can save and test this. And so it's asking us a language. We can say get response, and if it works, or we will see an error. And now we see this error saying user agent is missing. Please set your user agent header. And so this is the one I was surprised that it required it earlier, but we can change it to make that work. So in our server request, in the headers that we send to it, headers, there's an add header. And we want to send it a user agent, and I'm just going to say it's the PAA test user agent. They just, for some reason, they require that you give it one. They don't really care what one that you give it. They just want to know. So now we'll save and test again, pass nothing. We get back a big long list that includes ABC News, so it sure looks like it's working. And if I pass FR for French, it says here that we can look at our languages, and French is one of them. There's also Spanish, ES is Spanish. But if I pass French, then we get different sources. So we're getting Google News from France, and pass ES. So depending on how we call this, we get a different result each time. Okay, so now we have we've saved our API endpoint, and if you open an API endpoint, and there is this URL tells how to call it, and so we have we're going to copy that. This is the one that we're now going, by calling that from our listing as the data source, we're now going to get data through the intermediate. So we're just going to replace in our data source for that listing, tell it that we're going to call our API. We're going to do a get. Since it's returning the exact same body, we should get the exact same results. So we save that, we refresh, and we get lots of results, 128 results. So it's working. And our filtering, if we were to pick language, for example, it's working. It's a little bit hard to prove that it's working, or at least or to tell, looking based at this, to tell that it's working, because it looks exactly the same. So let's make a couple of changes to make it so that you know that it's working. If we edit our endpoint, one of the ways that we could prove that it's working would be that we could add, there is an action called wait that you can do that waits for the specified amount of time expressed in milliseconds. So 1000 is 1 second. We could add a 5 here. So this wait action would cause a 5-second delay every time you try to, we're going to put it in front of the server request. So our API now says, when we call it, it's going to wait 5 seconds, and then it's going to call the remote API and get us this data. So we'll save that and go back to our listing, and let's see if we can tell that now that's happening. If we if we click one of these drop downs, for example, you're going to see a wait. It's 5 seconds, and then it's going to pop up. And so this tells us that, among other things, every time that you're clicking or doing something within the listing, it's querying the underlying data to find that answer. So let's do that. We'll pick focus, and now we're seeing a 5-second wait while it builds back before it does the query building back. So we've proven that it works, right? That this API endpoint is functional. I'm going to go back to my outline, make sure that I'm staying on track here, don't get too far afield. So we did create this intermediate API, and we've also connected our action grid, our listing, to that intermediate API, and it functions as we intended, but we've also proven that it's connected by way of that wait delay. So let's do that. So now we're finally to the benefits. Why would you use an intermediate API? Well, one of the benefits that are available is caching. If you turn on caching for an intermediate API, or caching in general for things like tokens. What that means is that the first time that you access the API or the token, it gets the response. And then the next time that you access it, instead of doing the work, it just says, oh, I already have this answer and I'm going to provide the answer immediately. So if you were dealing with an API that took a long time to run, and I've seen some clients that do this, that are querying a remote database and a remote system, that HubSpot or whatever, and trying to get some information, and it takes 10 seconds for it to return the list that they need, and now maybe you need to manipulate that list, that it's taking 10 seconds every time. So caching will help solve that issue. So if we go back to our API and turn on the cache response, this is saying that for a period of time, we'll say 60 seconds, any call to this API with the exact same signature, meaning the same input parameters, language, it'll the first time it's going to do the work, the second time it's going to return it from cache. And so now let's see how this works in our listing. Let's do a full, we'll just clear these, and we'll see that there's this 5-second delay because it's still doing the work. But then as soon as that's done, we can click, and these other queries now are being served from the cache instead of another query to your remote source. So we've gotten a speed benefit. There may be other benefits. If, among other things, you're not putting a load on that remote server, maybe that's a server you control and you don't want to add extra hits to it. It could be it's a server that is charging you money for each hit, and perhaps so long as it's within their terms of service that you can cache the response, you're saving yourself some money with every hit. So variety of reasons that you might want to do that. And so caching, very easy to enable, and you can use that to speed up. And you can see it really isn't that much work. Yes, you have to create an intermediate API and turn it on, but other than that, it's not very much work. A little bit of additional work, you get a pretty big benefit. So that's the caching feature. Well, what else? What else can you do? Error handling. I showed earlier that if we don't get a response from that remote server, that the listing, the action grid, responds pretty poorly. So let's think about how we could do that to make it respond better. One way that you can do that would be to return that when an error occurs, that you return a payload that is that it conforms to what the grid is expecting, but doesn't contain any perhaps any real data, but at least it could explain. It doesn't show up a blow up message. Maybe it can explain what's going on. So let's do that. We'll take I'm gonna do just shorten this down a little bit. Oops, no, that's the right. I was trying to I don't know why that API isn't returning as I would expect it. We'll just.
I think that you did a question mark instead of an ampersand.
Thank you.
Yes.
got to use the right syntax. I just wanted a little bit shorter so that I can manipulate it. But I'm going to take this, and what we're going to do is by hand build a error payload, one that we're going to serve when things go wrong. So let me create a window to do that. I am using Notepad++, but you can use anything. I'm just trying to format, this nicely formats the JSON so that it's much more readable. My goal will be to just return one thing. So we have now I happen to get there, but we could say anything that we want here. In any payload that we want, but we're just going to return an error, a simple error payload. We could explain exactly what the error was, for example, by putting a token into the description, but we'll just use that. So going back and copying that and going back to our API definition, we have our actions, we have our server request. Within the server request, there is an on error section that if an error happened, we could set a different, we can do anything that we want here, do other actions. And so we could add an action, for example, that says that we're going to create a token, and the token is going to be is error true, just a flag that said an error happened, and then we're going to react to that, and then and we'll also say that we want to ignore it, meaning it's not going to stop the operation of our API, but rather just to do this, we're saying his error is true. To kind of make this all make sense, I'm going to add another context token at the top that says his error is false. So we start out with not an error, but in our server request, an error occurs, it is an error. And now how do we react to that? Well, we can add on our response, we'll send out results. As a matter of fact, we'll leave results alone. We're always going to send out results, but we can say we're going to create another token, or we're going to update the results token with our special payload, and we're only going to do it on certain condition, which is going to be this error. Got to put this in the right spot, and we'll update it a little bit. So if it's is error, then we're going to do a different payload. Now, first, let's prove that we haven't broken anything. So I'm going to save this and go back to our query. It's still got the 5-second delay in there, so we can see that it's working. It's working, and we have no errors. I am going to turn off caching so that we're actually working with this, and we can see we're not getting a cached response, we're getting a live response, and that way we can our actions are going to take effect immediately. And it's a little, since that remote URL is working and it's a good it's returning a good answer, we don't have an easy way to test for a failure, but we can trick our API into thinking it's a failure. So we'll say by default the error is true. This way it's going to return back our error payload. So if we refresh this now, it's still doing its wait just to prove it's working, but now we're getting our error payload a nice, so if an error had actually occurred, we've now insulated our listing from that and returning back a good payload. And we could provide far more information than this. As I mentioned, the description could include the error information. Just to illustrate that, if we edit our endpoint and take a look at the server request, it tells us that in the on error section that when an error occurs, you can use this structure, this syntax, to get the error response. So we could grab the results : error code or the results : error response and include that in our payload back to the user. Okay. So that's error handling and how to add some resiliency. So now I think we can just kind of, and Patrick, I'm going to drag you into this, even though you haven't, we haven't prepared this, but just a general discussion, some things that you could do with an intermediate API easily within Plankton app. We've already talked about caching, so the ability to improve performance and do some potential cost savings. Out of curiosity, Patrick, have you seen any of our clients doing either of these two things, or intermediate APIs in general?
Definitely using the intermediate API, yes. I think that it creates a nice ability to do testing. So if you see something going wrong or not working right, you can isolate the API call away from the actual implementation, so that you can get immediate results and test things.
Yep. In terms of caching, we do this internally. When you within Plankton app, the app, and you have, for example, hotfixes, you need to query, the app queries our servers to say what hotfixes are available, and those are served by an API that's cached. So that reduces that improves performance to the user, and it reduces load on our servers. Right, we don't have to build the list every time. We can serve up a standard list that doesn't change very often. So that's caching. There's another one. We did talk about error handling, the ability to control the experience. You could also, when an error occurs, log that somewhere, and so now you know that you have information available to know that an error has occurred. So that's another one. Usage tracking. This isn't hard to imagine at all. When you build your API, you can write out the call to the API to a database, to an entity. So and anything that comes in from the parameters could be logged. So, for example, you could create an entity that has who is using the API, what form or page they're using the API from. So maybe there's a listing over here, there's a form over there. All these different areas within your site are calling the same API, but now you're able to log the usage in a central place and to know about it. And so that gives you the ability to make better decisions about how it's used. So you've got the visibility, the decision making, be able to check patterns. So it's another use. It gives you a level of control, right? You can turn on or off your centralized API, your intermediate API, and perhaps you don't want to. So during certain periods, maybe they have peak pricing on something that you're buying, and during peak times you don't want to allow it. So you could control that access through your API in a centralized spot, regardless, and not do that throughout your application, but rather just your various implementations all call the same one, which then gives you that level of control. And then to the one that Patrick went to right away, this ability to test by having your API completely separate from your implementation. You want to see what's going on with the data, you can just open it up, hit the test button, provide some parameters, and see the results. In the same way, that there's so many advantages to centralizing it. The API key, for example, lots of remote services, if you use an API key or some form of credentials, they force you to change the credentials from time to time. So if you have an API that you're calling and you're doing that throughout your application and your credentials change, or maybe the endpoint changes from version 1 to version 2, having that in a nice central spot lets you just adjust your API, and then instead of the 17 places that occurs within your application. If it's a chargeable thing, it gives you the ability to monitor billing. You can compare your actual usage to the billing from the service. We mentioned, outage logging, being able to see when something is down. Data enhancement is another one. You might be calling a remote API like the news API, and then you want to enhance it with something that's on your system that you know about. And so you've got some other data table that goes along with data that's coming in from the live system. You can manipulate the JSON output to include extra information, or use it to suppress records that perhaps, for example, you don't want to provide access to certain news sources. You could use that to suppress a particular news source, even though it's being returned by the API. So it gives you a lot more control over the data. And then, yeah, I jumped into this already, but the ability to update. So lots of reasons why you might want to use an intermediate API. Been a quiet session today. If anybody has any questions, it'd be a great time. We can handle those in the last few minutes. I'll talk about, while I'm checking, giving you a chance to respond to that, I will bring up one more, which is one or two more here. I don't know, compliance. Sometimes when you're accessing data, you need to be able to comply, be able to provide tracking and how you used information, why you used information, perhaps with an external audit. So that would be another possible use case. And throttling, being able to, you could use that to regulate X number of calls to a particular user, or X number of calls per hour to a particular user. So you could implement your own throttling to just prevent or control the use of that resource. Security is another issue that gives you control over. And so, yeah, that's it. All right. So takeaways, not hard to do. Several immediate benefits are possible. There's conditions where this is going to come up, and so you're hopefully this is just another tool in your low code tool belt to be able to include an intermediate API. And for some of you, maybe this is the first time that you saw that server request can be used as a source to a listing. So that's I believe it can also be used for source for drop downs too, right, Patrick?
Mhm.
So lots of other ways besides just simply using the databases we often do. It gives you the ability to connect out to other systems. So hopefully that was a good exposure to all of that. And with that, I will say glad that you joined us for this hour. I'll remind you that in 1 week, we'll do our end of year special, talk about where we've been, where we're going, and some new products that are out there. So with that, happy low coding. Thanks for joining.